"Take her to the cheapest ward," my father told the paramedic while I lay there trying to keep my eyes open. "If she dies, at least we won't waste more money." I remember the fluorescent lights above me sliding past in blurred streaks as they rolled my stretcher through the emergency entrance of St. Vincent Medical Center. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp enough to make my stomach turn. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped steadily, cold and mechanical, like it didn't care whether I lived or died. Neither did my father. I was still conscious when he said those words. Barely. My head felt heavy, and every breath came slowly, but I heard him clearly. Every single syllable. "She's 67 years old anyway," he muttered under his breath. "No point spending a fortune now." The paramedic didn't answer him right away. I think even he was shocked. I tried to move my hand, just enough to let someone know I could hear everything, but my body refused to cooperate. My father, Frank Carter, had always treated money like it mattered more than people. More than family. More than me. But hearing those words while I drifted in and out of consciousness did something to me. It broke the last illusion I still carried about him. Outside, rain hammered against the ambulance bay doors. Earlier that evening, I had been leaving the grocery store with 2 paper bags balanced against my hip. I remember checking my shopping list twice because eggs had gotten so expensive lately. Then headlights. Tires screeching somewhere far away. A sudden impact. After that, voices. Strangers leaning over me. Someone saying help was coming. And then my father arriving at the hospital before they even finished examining me. That was the strange part. Frank lived nearly 40 minutes away in Clearwater Hills, yet somehow he appeared almost immediately after the ambulance did. At the time, my mind was too foggy to question it. But later, I would remember every detail. Every expression. Every sentence. "Sir, your daughter needs additional scans," a nurse explained carefully as they wheeled me through the hallway. "We need to rule out internal injuries." My father sighed loudly, the same irritated sigh he used when customer service lines kept him waiting too long. "Do whatever insurance covers," he said flatly. "Nothing extra." Insurance. That word again. Even through the haze clouding my mind, I noticed how focused he was on money. Not once did he ask if I was in pain. Not once did he hold my hand or tell me I'd be okay. He only asked about costs. About coverage. About paperwork. As they pushed me toward imaging, I heard him speaking quietly into his phone behind us. His voice dropped lower, tense and hurried. "No," he whispered. "Don't let them inspect the brakes yet." My eyes opened slightly at those words. Brakes. For one brief second, the hallway seemed to go completely silent around me. Then darkness pulled me under before I could understand what he meant. When I opened my eyes again, the room was dark except for the pale blue glow of a television mounted high in the corner. Some late-night game show flickered silently across the screen while rain continued tapping softly against the hospital window beside me. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the ache in my ribs reminded me. I shifted carefully beneath the thin blanket and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in my body felt stiff and heavy, as if I had aged another 10 years overnight. A small plastic wristband scratched against my skin when I lifted my hand toward my forehead. Evelyn Carter. Room 214B. Observation ward. The cheapest ward available, apparently. I stared at the ceiling tiles for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of hospital life. Rolling carts. Intercom announcements. Quiet footsteps in the hallway. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying softly behind a closed door. The loneliness inside that room settled over me slowly, like cold water rising inch by inch. No flowers sat on the bedside table. No balloons. No overnight bag from family. My father had not even bothered to leave a sweater for me, and the hospital air conditioning kept the room uncomfortably cold. A nurse entered a few minutes later carrying a paper cup and a small tray of medication. She looked to be in her early 30s with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose bun. Her badge read Abigail Moore. She offered me a gentle smile that felt strangely comforting after everything else. "You are finally awake," she said softly. "You gave us a scare earlier." Her voice carried the kind of warmth I had not heard in years. I tried to smile back, but my throat felt dry. "How long was I asleep?" "About 6 hours," she replied while checking the monitor beside my bed. "You had a mild concussion, but your scans came back stable." Stable. Such a strange word. My entire life felt anything but stable. Abigail handed me the cup of water and adjusted my blanket carefully around my shoulders. "Your father stopped by earlier," she added after a pause. "He said he would return tomorrow." I looked down at the faded hospital blanket instead of answering. Return tomorrow. As if visiting me were another errand squeezed between golf appointments and banking meetings. Abigail must have noticed something in my expression because her voice softened even more. "Do you need me to call anyone else for you? A friend? Another relative?" The question caught me off guard. I realized then how small my world had become over the years. My husband, Daniel, had passed away almost 12 years earlier from heart disease. We never had children. Most of my old friends had either moved away or drifted into their own lives. And Frank had made sure family gatherings became uncomfortable enough that eventually I stopped attending them altogether. "No," I whispered quietly. "There is nobody else." Abigail nodded without pity, which somehow made me trust her more. Before leaving, she hesitated near the doorway. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "there is something I probably should not mention yet, but your father seemed very concerned about your insurance information tonight. More concerned than most family members usually are." My stomach tightened instantly. "What do you mean?" She glanced down the hallway before lowering her voice slightly. "He asked the billing department several questions about payout coverage and beneficiary processing." Beneficiary. The word hit me harder than the accident itself. Suddenly, I remembered his voice near the hallway. "Do not let them inspect the breaks yet." A cold feeling crept slowly through my chest as rain continued tapping against the hospital window. For the first time since waking up, I stopped wondering whether the accident had been bad luck. And I started wondering whether it had really been an accident at all. Sleep did not come easily after that conversation. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing my father's voice in the hallway. Calm. Cold. Careful with every word. By morning, the storm outside had passed, leaving pale sunlight spilling through the thin hospital curtains. The parking lot below looked wet and silver under the early Florida heat. Nurses moved through the hallway with quiet efficiency while carts rattled over polished tile floors. Everything around me felt painfully normal, and somehow that made my thoughts even worse. Around 8 o'clock, Abigail returned carrying a small tray with dry toast, scrambled eggs, and weak coffee. "How are you feeling today?" she asked gently while checking the chart at the foot of my bed. "Like I got hit by a truck," I answered quietly. She smiled faintly at that, but her expression quickly turned serious again. "Your doctor wants to keep you one more night for observation. Mostly because of the concussion." I nodded slowly. The truth was, part of me felt safer inside that hospital room than I had felt at home in years. My little condo in Clearwater suddenly seemed very far away. So did the life I thought I understood. Abigail adjusted the blanket near my legs before lowering her voice slightly. "Your father called twice already this morning." I looked up immediately. "Did he ask about me?" "Not exactly," she admitted carefully. "He wanted to know when billing would finalize your paperwork." Something inside me sank quietly. Even now, lying in a hospital bed with bruises across my chest and stitches near my hairline, I was still just another expense to Frank Carter. Abigail hesitated for a moment before sitting down briefly in the chair beside my bed. I probably should not say this, she said softly, but something about him feels off. I stared down at my untouched coffee. He has always been that way. Saying it out loud made me realize how long I had spent excusing his behavior. My father had never been openly cruel in public. That was what made him so difficult to explain to other people. He donated money to churches. He volunteered at charity golf events. Neighbors described him as disciplined and respectable. But behind closed doors, everything revolved around control. Especially money. When I was 12 years old, I broke my wrist falling off my bicycle 2 weeks before Christmas. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table while my father complained about emergency room costs instead of asking whether I was hurting. "You kids are expensive enough without adding hospital bills," he muttered while signing paperwork. My mother cried quietly that night after she thought I was asleep. Years later, after she passed away from cancer, Frank became even colder. He remarried Linda less than 11 months later. Linda was polished and charming in public, but she learned quickly how to speak my father's language. Investments. Property taxes. Inheritance planning. They treated relationships like business contracts. And somehow, over time, I became the one thing they both viewed as unprofitable. A burden with medical bills and no children to carry the family name forward. Abigail interrupted my thoughts carefully. "There is something else," she said. "This morning someone from the insurance company called asking detailed questions about your condition." I frowned immediately. "That seems fast." "That is exactly what I thought." She looked toward the hallway before continuing. "Usually these things take days. Sometimes weeks." A strange heaviness settled into my stomach. The timing felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. My father arriving too quickly. His obsession with insurance. The missing concern. The comment about brakes. Suddenly, even the accident itself no longer felt random in my memory. I remembered pulling out of the grocery store parking lot slowly because traffic had been heavier than usual. I remembered pressing my brake pedal near the intersection. And I remembered the horrible feeling when the car did not slow down the way it should have. My pulse quickened beneath the hospital monitor beside me. Abigail noticed immediately. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "what is it?" I looked toward the bright hospital window as a terrible thought finally formed completely in my mind. I do not think my brakes failed by accident. The rest of that morning passed in a strange blur of silence and suspicion. Every sound inside the hospital seemed sharper now. The squeak of nurses' shoes against the floor. The distant ringing of telephones behind the reception desk. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner above my bed felt irritatingly loud. Once doubt enters your mind, it changes the shape of everything around you. Around noon, Abigail returned carrying fresh linens and a small paper folder tucked beneath her arm. She closed the door quietly behind her before speaking. "Your father is downstairs," she said. My stomach tightened immediately. "Did he ask to come up?" "No," she answered. "He only stopped by the billing office again." I let out a slow breath and stared toward the window. Outside, palm trees swayed gently under bright Florida sunlight while cars rolled through the parking garage below. Somewhere out there, people were buying coffee, running errands, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my own father seemed more interested in paperwork than whether I could walk properly again. Abigail hesitated before placing the folder carefully on my bedside table. "I know this is probably not my place," she said quietly, "but I printed something you may want to look at." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of insurance authorization forms. At first, none of it made sense. Numbers. Policy codes. Signature dates. Then I saw it. Beneficiary, Frank Carter. Policy value, $2,300,000. Effective date, 11 days earlier. My chest felt cold. I never signed for this, I whispered. Abigail nodded carefully. That is what worried me. I kept staring at the page while memories surfaced one after another. 3 weeks earlier, my father invited me to lunch at Bayside Grill, something he almost never did. He spent most of the meal acting unusually pleasant, asking about my health and whether I had updated my estate documents recently. At the time, I thought maybe age was softening him. I remember feeling almost grateful for the attention. Near the end of lunch, he slid several papers across the table casually. Just standard financial updates, he said. Sign where the tabs are. I should have read them more carefully. But the restaurant was loud, and Frank always became impatient whenever people questioned him. So I signed. God help me, I signed everything. Abigail pulled the chair closer to my bed. Evelyn, she asked softly, did your father ever have access to your vehicle? I closed my eyes briefly. Last month my brakes were making a grinding sound. Even saying the words aloud made my pulse quicken. Frank insisted on taking the car to a mechanic friend of his because he said dealerships overcharge people. The room went very still after that. I remembered the exact afternoon now. Frank standing in my condo parking lot with my keys in his hand. Linda sitting in the passenger seat of their Lexus wearing oversized sunglasses and pretending not to listen. My father telling me, you are lucky you still have family willing to help you. Family. The word felt poisonous now. Abigail looked disturbed but stayed calm. Do you know the name of the mechanic? I nodded slowly. Harold Bennett. Bennett Auto Repair in Clearwater. She wrote it down carefully on the corner of a notepad. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then footsteps approached down the hallway outside my room. Slow. Heavy. Familiar. My father's voice drifted faintly through the partially closed door. I do not need another expensive overnight charge, he snapped at someone near the nurse's station. If she can talk, she can leave. I stared at the insurance papers trembling slightly in my hands while something inside me finally hardened. All my life, I had mistaken fear for loyalty. But lying there in that hospital bed, listening to my father complain about the cost of keeping me alive, I realized something terrifying. Frank Carter was not worried about losing me. He was worried about losing money. My father finally entered the room 20 minutes later carrying a paper cup of coffee and the same irritated expression he wore whenever airport lines moved too slowly. He did not hug me. He did not ask whether I was feeling better. He simply stood near the foot of the bed looking around the room like he was inspecting a hotel he regretted booking. You look fine, he said flatly. They are keeping you here too long. I folded the insurance papers beneath the blanket before he could see them. The doctors wanted observation. Doctors always want something expensive. He took a sip of coffee and glanced toward the monitor beside me. You should probably be discharged tomorrow. There it was again. Not concern for my recovery. Only concern about cost. I watched him carefully while he avoided eye contact, and for the first time in my life, I noticed how rehearsed he sounded. Every sentence came too quickly, like he had practiced them in advance. His gray polo shirt looked freshly pressed. His expensive watch gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Nothing about him looked like a man shaken by nearly losing his daughter. How is Linda? I asked quietly. He shrugged. Busy. Busy. That was all. I remembered when my husband Daniel spent 3 days in the hospital before he passed away. I barely left his bedside except to refill coffee or speak with doctors. Love makes people stay. Obligation makes them look at their watches. My father checked his phone twice during the next minute. Then he lowered his voice slightly. There is another issue we need to discuss. My stomach tightened immediately. What issue? Your condo. He finally looked at me directly. If your injuries become long-term, you may not be able to manage alone anymore. I almost laughed from disbelief. 2 days earlier he complained about paying for my hospital room, and now suddenly he was worried about my living arrangements. I can manage my own condo, I replied carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. You always were stubborn. He stepped closer to the bed and lowered his voice even further. Listen, Evelyn. At your age, accidents like this change things. Maybe it is time to think practically. Practically. Another one of his favorite words. Practical always meant whatever benefited him most. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. He slid a folder onto my bedside table. Property transfer forms. Preliminary assisted living brochures. My chest felt cold all over again. You prepared this already? For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. Only briefly. Linda thought it would be smart to get ahead of things. Linda. Of course. I stared at the paperwork while memories rushed through my mind. The insurance forms. The brake repair. The beneficiary changes. And now property transfer papers waiting beside my hospital bed before I had even been discharged. It was too fast. All of it. My father mistook my silence for weakness. He sat down in the chair beside me and sighed heavily, performing concern the same way actors perform sadness in bad television dramas. You have to understand, he said. These situations create financial complications. Financial complications. That was what my possible death meant to him. I looked down at my hands resting quietly above the blanket. Bruised. Trembling slightly. Older than I remembered them being. Then I noticed something sticking partially out of his shirt pocket. A folded receipt from Bennett Auto Repair. My pulse quickened instantly. Before I could think better of it, I asked softly, did Harold ever finish fixing my brakes? The room became completely still. My father froze for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough. Then his expression hardened immediately. I do not know what you are talking about. He stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over the coffee cup beside my bed. You should get some rest. And just like that, he walked out of the room. But this time, I noticed something I had missed before. My father was not acting like a grieving parent. He was acting like a man afraid of making a mistake. After my father left the room, I sat perfectly still beneath the thin hospital blanket while sunlight slowly shifted across the floor tiles beside my bed. My heart would not stop racing. Every instinct inside me kept repeating the same terrifying thought. He knows I suspect something. For years, I had survived by staying quiet around Frank Carter. Silence kept the peace. Silence avoided arguments. Silence made life easier. But now, for the first time, I understood that silence had also made me blind. Abigail returned later that afternoon carrying fresh ice water and a clipboard. The moment she stepped inside, she noticed my expression. What happened? She asked softly. I looked toward the closed door before answering. I think my father is afraid. Saying it aloud made the entire situation feel even more real. Abigail sat carefully in the chair beside my bed again. I handed her the assisted living papers without speaking. As she read through them, her face tightened with disbelief. These were prepared already, she asked quietly. Before I have even been discharged. Abigail shook her head slowly. This is not normal. No. None of it was normal anymore. Not the insurance policy. Not the brake repair. Not the property transfer forms waiting conveniently beside my hospital bed. And certainly not my father's obsession with expenses while I lay bruised and stitched together beneath fluorescent lights. I stared down at my hands while an idea slowly formed in my mind. Dangerous. Risky. But necessary. I need him to believe I remember less than I do, I whispered. Abigail looked confused at first. What do you mean? The concussion. I lifted my eyes toward her carefully. If he thinks my memory is damaged, he might stop being so careful. For a moment she said nothing. Then I watched realization settle across her face. You want him to relax, she said quietly. Exactly. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. People reveal themselves when they think they are safe. That evening, my father returned with Linda beside him for the first time since the accident. She entered the room wearing expensive white slacks and carrying a bouquet of pale pink roses that still had the florist tag attached. The flowers looked more like evidence than affection. Evelyn, she said softly, placing them on the windowsill. You gave us such a fright. Her voice sounded polished and rehearsed, just like always. I forced a weak smile and blinked slowly as if struggling to focus. I am sorry, I murmured quietly. Everything still feels foggy. My father exchanged a quick glance with Linda. Tiny. Fast. But I caught it. Foggy how? He asked immediately. I pretended to think for several seconds before answering. I remember leaving the grocery store. Then lights. Then the hospital. I paused carefully. Some things are missing. Linda's shoulders relaxed almost invisibly. My father sat down near the foot of the bed, studying me closely. Do you remember speaking to anyone after the accident? He asked. There it was. Not concern. Not comfort. Investigation. I lowered my eyes and shook my head slowly. Not really. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush the room. Then, for the first time since this nightmare began, my father smiled slightly. Small. Brief. But unmistakable. Relief. Abigail entered a few minutes later to check my vitals, and I noticed how quickly my father stood up when she mentioned cognitive observation notes for concussion patients. He suddenly seemed eager to leave. Get some rest, he told me while grabbing his car keys. Do not strain yourself trying to remember things. I watched him walk toward the door beside Linda, both of them visibly calmer than before. The moment they disappeared into the hallway, Abigail turned back toward me slowly. That smile, she whispered. I nodded once. Cold settled deep inside my chest. My father was no longer worried about my recovery. He was worried about my memory. By the third day, pretending became easier than I expected. Maybe because people already assumed older women were fragile. Forgetful. Confused. It did not take much for my father to believe the concussion had damaged my memory. I repeated simple questions twice. I occasionally paused mid-sentence as if searching for words. Once, I deliberately forgot the name of my physical therapist while Frank sat beside my bed pretending to read financial emails on his phone. Every small mistake made him visibly calmer. And the calmer he became, the more careless he grew. Abigail noticed it too. He is talking more freely now, she whispered one afternoon while checking my blood pressure. Yesterday I overheard him discussing paperwork on the phone outside your room. I looked toward the closed hospital door carefully. What kind of paperwork? Estate transfers, she answered quietly. And something about vehicle reports. My chest tightened instantly. That afternoon, my father arrived alone carrying a folder and an expensive fruit basket he clearly had not picked out himself. He set the basket beside the untouched flowers Linda brought earlier in the week. The roses were already beginning to wilt around the edges. Somehow that felt symbolic. You seem more rested today, he said while taking a seat near the window. I think so, I answered softly, forcing uncertainty into my voice. The doctors said memory takes time. Yes, he replied quickly. Too quickly. Exactly. He opened the folder on his lap and removed several sheets of paper. Since you are recovering, I thought we could take care of some practical matters now instead of later. Practical again. Always practical. I stared blankly at the papers as if struggling to focus. What are they? Just temporary authorization forms, he explained smoothly. In case you need assistance managing bills while you recover. I recognized enough legal language to understand what he was really asking for. Access to my accounts. Control over my condo. Authority over financial decisions. My father slid a pen gently across the blanket toward me. No pressure, he said with fake patience. I just want to help. Help. That word nearly made me sick. Before I could answer, voices drifted faintly from the hallway outside. 2 nurses speaking near the station. One of them laughed softly at something. My father's attention flickered briefly toward the door, and in that moment his phone lit up beside him on the chair cushion. Linda's name appeared across the screen. He answered immediately but lowered his voice. I am with her now, he muttered. A pause. Then quieter still. No, she barely remembers anything. I kept my eyes lowered, pretending not to notice. Harold is nervous for nothing, he whispered after another pause. There is no proof the brakes were touched. My pulse pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. I forced myself to stay perfectly still while he continued speaking in hushed fragments. The insurance company already confirmed the payout process. Another pause. Then the sentence that changed everything. Once the condo is transferred, this entire mess finally becomes worth it. Worth it. I stared at the white hospital blanket covering my legs while those words settled deep inside me like ice water. My own father was discussing my accident like a delayed business investment. A burden finally becoming profitable. When he ended the call, he looked up and smiled politely as if nothing had happened. You should really sign these while you are thinking clearly, he said, sliding the pen closer again. I looked at the paperwork for several long seconds before lifting my eyes toward him slowly. Then, in the softest voice possible, I asked, Dad, did something happen to my car? For the briefest moment, all color disappeared from his face. My father recovered quickly after that moment, but not quickly enough. I saw it clearly. The panic in his eyes. The split second where his carefully controlled expression disappeared completely. Then his face hardened again like wet cement drying too fast in the sun. What kind of question is that? He asked sharply. I lowered my eyes immediately, pretending confusion instead of suspicion. I do not know, I murmured softly. Sometimes I feel like pieces are coming back. He stared at me for several long seconds. I could almost hear him thinking. Calculating. Measuring risk the same way he always measured everything else in life. Then finally he forced a small smile. The doctors warned memory can be unreliable after concussions, he said carefully. You should not stress yourself chasing random thoughts. Random thoughts. That was what he wanted this entire nightmare to become. A confused old woman imagining things. Before I could answer, Abigail entered carrying a medication tray. The moment she stepped into the room, my father stood up quickly and gathered the unsigned papers from the bed. I should let her rest, he announced. Abigail gave him a polite nod, though I noticed her eyes briefly flick toward the folder in his hands. My father paused near the doorway before looking back at me one final time. Do not push yourself too hard trying to remember things that may not even matter, he said quietly. Then he walked out. The second the door closed behind him, the tension drained from my body so suddenly I almost started shaking. Abigail immediately placed the tray down and locked the door. You heard everything? I asked. She nodded once. Enough. I stared toward the window where late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the floor. He knows I remember more than I should. Abigail pulled the chair beside my bed closer again. Then we stop pretending this is only suspicion. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear determination underneath it now. She reached into her scrub pocket and removed her phone. I recorded part of his conversation outside the hallway yesterday. I looked up sharply. You did? She nodded carefully. Hospital staff hear things. Most of the time we stay out of family matters. But this, she hesitated briefly. This feels dangerous. Abigail pressed play quietly. My father's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. Once the payout clears, the condo issue solves itself. Another pause. Then Linda's voice answered softly through static. Harold said nobody will inspect the vehicle if the insurance closes quickly. My chest tightened so hard it became difficult to breathe for a second. Hearing it recorded made everything real in a way suspicion never could. My father was not merely greedy. He had planned things. Organized them. Discussed them calmly like people planning a vacation itinerary. Abigail lowered the phone slowly. There is more, she said quietly. This morning someone came asking for you. Who? A mechanic. Every nerve inside me seemed to wake up instantly. Harold? She shook her head. No. Another man from the same garage. His name was Daniel Ruiz. My pulse quickened. What did he want? Abigail looked toward the locked door before answering. He said he needed to speak with you privately because he felt guilty about something related to your car. The room went completely silent. Outside, I could hear distant ambulance sirens somewhere beyond the hospital parking lot. For years, I believed my father's cruelty came from emotional distance. I told myself he simply did not know how to love properly. But this was something colder. Something deliberate. Abigail placed her hand gently over mine. Evelyn, she said carefully, I think someone may have helped cause that accident. I closed my eyes briefly while memories flashed through my mind again. My father insisting on handling the brake repairs himself. The sudden insurance policy. The property transfer forms prepared before I could even walk steadily again. Then his voice in the ambulance. Cheapest ward. Less money wasted. When I opened my eyes again, something inside me had changed completely. Fear was still there. But now it stood beside something stronger. Clarity. Daniel Ruiz arrived just after 7 that evening wearing grease-stained work boots and a faded blue mechanic shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. He looked nervous the moment he stepped inside my hospital room. His eyes kept darting toward the hallway as if he expected someone to follow him. Abigail closed the door quietly behind him and remained near the nurse's station outside to give us privacy. Daniel stood awkwardly at the foot of my bed holding an old baseball cap in both hands. Miss Carter, he said carefully, I am real sorry about what happened to you. I studied him silently for a moment before answering. You work at Bennett Auto Repair? He nodded once. Been there almost 14 years. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long carrying guilt alone. Your father brought your car in about 3 weeks ago. My chest tightened immediately, but I kept my expression calm. What happened to it? Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. At first, nothing unusual. Brake pads needed replacing. Fluid lines looked worn. He hesitated briefly. Then your father came back after hours 2 days later. The room seemed to grow quieter around us. Why? I asked softly. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor tiles. He asked Harold to delay part of the repair work. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest. Delay? Your brake line had a weak connector near the master cylinder, he explained carefully. It should have been replaced immediately. He paused again, visibly uncomfortable. But Harold said your father wanted to wait until after some insurance paperwork cleared. I stared at him in disbelief. You are telling me they knowingly let me drive an unsafe car? Daniel looked miserable. I argued with Harold about it. I swear I did. But Harold said your father promised nobody would get hurt because you barely drove anywhere except grocery stores and church. The fluorescent lights above us hummed softly while his words settled over me one by one. Grocery stores and church. My entire life reduced to predictable routes easy to calculate. Easy to risk. Daniel finally looked up at me directly. After your accident made the news, I could not sleep anymore, he admitted quietly. Then yesterday Harold started panicking because your father kept calling the garage asking whether anyone inspected the vehicle yet. My pulse pounded steadily in my ears. Every missing piece was finally connecting together. The insurance policy. The property transfer forms. The urgency. The fear in my father's eyes every time memory came up. Daniel reached into his pocket slowly and removed a folded repair invoice. I made a copy before Harold shredded the originals, he said. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. There, near the bottom beside handwritten service notes, was my father's signature. And beneath it, one sentence written in rushed blue ink. Delay full replacement until authorization clears. I stared at the words for a very long time. My father always taught me that character mattered more than reputation. Yet all his life he protected reputation while quietly destroying his own character behind closed doors. Daniel exhaled shakily. I know this probably does not fix anything, he said softly. But I could not keep pretending I did not know. I folded the invoice carefully and placed it beside the insurance forms on my bedside table. Then I looked out the hospital window toward the dark Florida sky where distant city lights flickered against the horizon. For most of my life, I kept waiting for my father to become someone different. Kinder. Warmer. More human. But people eventually reveal exactly who they are. Sometimes it simply takes surviving the worst day of your life to finally see them clearly. I looked back toward Daniel quietly. Thank you for telling me the truth, I said. And for the first time since the accident, I realized something important. I was no longer afraid of my father. He was finally afraid of me.